Welcome to Best Practices on How to Transition to Online Presenting. My name is Sharyn Fitzpatrick, aka the Webinar Chick. Many of you may know me as the former editor of Presentation Expert and the webinar host for a series of great how-to and best practice webinars with the who's who in the presentation world. In the last 5 years, I've been working with several companies on transitioning their in-person speakers and content to become engaging online presenters with just content that rocks. But first, I want to share what I tell all my speakers who are new to online presentations. Don't panic, take a deep breath, you got this. So I just took Garland. The irony of this is the slide that I'm sharing is don't panic, you can do this. So it's pretty much the theme of what we're trying to do. And one of the things we didn't do was panic. We just kind of took steps back and redid it and figured out how to get in. And one of the things I like to say is you need to show grace under pressure, because a lot of times technology just fails and there's nothing you can do about it. So I had an
issue yesterday too, where the basically my computer suddenly said, you know, that the Zoom program locked it up entirely and it had to reboot. And fortunately, we just finished one presenter, and then come back, and so it worked fine. But it was a it was a temporary issue.
So how many folks do we have back?
We have about 19 back. So I think people will probably kind of start coming in. Maybe
there's a bunch of chats coming in as well. We're back, no worries.
There's chats coming in, and Usario said the same thing you did, like the just-in-time slide. Yes, was
great. I'm going to stop sharing my video in case that led to us kind of eliminating that. I'll put it back on a little bit later. But as I said, seems like a perfect place to start. Don't panic. You can do this, and I really do believe that. It's just really different day. Same program. You're just figuring out how to promote online or speak online, and that's what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I have a feeling, my best guess is maybe that the problem was, like, one of my colleague Kurt has, of course, access to the same system. He may have inadvertently clicked on start webinar intending to join the webinar or something if he'd logged out. That's just a guess, because that was, the error message was more something like the meeting, someone else has started a meeting with the same ID. So that would only be Kurt or I that would have access. So I don't know if that's what happened, but that would be a guess.
So the question I always get when we kind of do this is, okay, I've now been told I have to do a webinar. I know nothing about it. What do I do and where do I start? So I thought the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to look at what your experience has been as an attendee, what you liked or didn't like. I hate people that talk over each other. I don't like people just having slides that are so text heavy I can't read it. So I don't like to go to webinars where I'm so bored I'm multitasking and totally waste my time. So I would suggest, if any of you have ideas or what has been your experience as an attendee and things that you would take with that to bring back to your own webinars. So I think that's kind of the fun part of doing this. So we've got a couple of chat questions, but I guess we have something about a different meeting per day. Okay, so don't panic slide. Perfect slide. So perfect there. So if you have any ideas or questions or thoughts about what you like and dislike about being an attendee, let me know. So I'm going to go to our next slide. And I always like to say, take that experience and put yourself in someone else's shoes. What do effective speakers do well? Or what do they do wrong? So I look at it and think the characteristics of any great speaker is focus, making sure that you're focused on the right content and that you're delivering the information that people need. Delivery skills. You don't want to have a voice like this, or sometimes I deal with a lot of second language presenters who really struggle to maybe be precise and deliver a good webinar because they're still focused on the fact that English is their second language. And then I like to talk about engaging storytellers, because I think that that's how you hook people in for either as a speaker, whether it be online or in person, is by engaging them, telling a story, making it personal, figuring out how they can then come away with understanding what's in it for them. And then something I mentioned earlier is patience and grace under fire. It takes time. And one of the things you don't want to do is come across as being panicked because something has gone wrong, because then you'll really put your attendees at in an uncomfortable position. And I think the way we did this today was a perfect example of how to do it. So when you transition to an online presenter, we have to kind of figure out what's next. And I do really believe that content is king. You have to create a content plan that is well thought out and can be delivered online. You want to ask yourself, what content is appealing to your audience demographic? That's when you put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand, what if you're an expert in webinars or an expert in emotional intelligence? How do you find content that's going to be appealing to the audience demographic that you've picked out? One of the other things I like to do is to create handouts that highlight your content. It doesn't have to be just your slides. You can create handouts based on your slides. And one of the things you want to do is maybe give them templates. I have a webinar template that I use. Sorry, I broke my cardinal rule, which was not muting my own cell phone. So apologies there, I thought I had. So that's something you don't do when you're trying to be presenting. So I like to share templates when I do have a webinar, and you're all welcome to have any of my sample templates. I have a script. I create a creative brief for each webinar that gives the basics. What's the abstract? What's the title? If we're doing email or social media, what graphics, what subject lines can we come up with? And I found this especially useful in one of my clients, which is a software-defined networking company, where it's really heavy tech, and you send out an email where you're not even sure what the subject line is. So you try and do something like, is your head of security, is your head of security in the clouds? So you're trying to do something around cybersecurity based on cloud. So you try and make it engaging and fun. So the templates are a great way to make sure everybody is on the same page. So when you go to promote the webinar, you have a list of everything that you need. You know exactly what you're supposed to say. You know what the graphics are. And it's a great way to check that one off your list. Here's an example of some sample handouts. These were made and created from slides. So here's one, the really simple one in the middle, where you can see that we just kind of took pictures of the slides and then listed some content. Here is one where we took some more of the slides that we had, but we tried to create some eye candy with the percentages. And this third one is an infographic that you can use and print as a handout. Instead of printing the entire presentation, they created an infographic. This was a great use of how things could be done. So I like to say, tell me the whole story from start to finish. And so I think part of that story is, how they got where they are. Tell the story the way you talk. I like to have everything that I do as a conversation. I want it to be a two-way conversation. That's why I'm saying, please feel free to use chat and some of the other things that are there. I like to use strong visuals. I like to make it personal and easy to relate to. And I like to add a surprise. And sometimes that surprise could be a picture, or because I'm trying to get a point. The idea is to also make sure you're still awake out there, get a laugh out of you. Humor is one of the fun things you can do in trying to do this, especially when you talk about good slides and bad slides. So my next thing is, oh my God, I don't know how to use the webinar platform. I know that the case study I'm going to share with you, that was a major concern, and people became so paralyzed by the whole idea of using the platform that they kind of lost the point and they got flustered. They focused on the platform instead of their content. So I really suggest that whatever platform you use, and there are a lot of great ones out there, GoToWebinar, On24, Zoom, BrightTalk, ReadyTalk, Fuse. Happy to talk about any of them and kind of tell you what I'm looking at. I'm in the process of evaluating a Zoom webinar platform for a client I've had for 4 years. Is it going to be in place of GoToWebinar, or is it going to be in addition to? And then kind of understanding, you know, what we need to have from a level of knowledge in order to figure out how to do it. So what I always suggest is take the technology for a test drive. Understand what the dashboard looks like, how you answer questions, how you launch screen share. What is it that's there that you should be using? For example, in GoToWebinar, I use polls all the time. I will ask people to raise their hands. I will launch a poll about a specific question and make sure that we share the answer. And it's a great conversation starter, especially if you have more than one presenter on. It's a great way to keep and build that interactive discussion. You can also ask an expert to show you the ropes and offer suggestions. That's what I do. I am a producer. I go in and set up the webinars and find a way to make it comfortable from the back end production and the technology so my speakers can actually concentrate on what they know, which is the content. I also insist that everyone does at least 2 dry runs. One is for their content, to make sure it looks well, it works, and the other is the technology itself, and I do throw some of them under the bus to help them understand the best way to manage, how to handle things under pressure.
Sharyn, do you want to take questions as they come up, or do you want to wait till the end?
Sure, I'm happy to take questions as they come up.
Okay. Well, there are a couple of comments. This is a comment more than the question, but Deborah had said, don't like it when presenters have not checked out or become familiar with the software they're using to give the webinar. And I think that was what you were just talking about.
Yeah, definitely. I've had some real failures with, as I said, people who get so embroiled in and are overwhelmed by the technology that they lose sight of what they're trying to do.
And
so it's
Emily has asked, do you have trouble with the chat box splitting your attention? That's sometimes a problem with our webinars, she says.
Not really, because I think there's ways to do it. In some webinars, especially the technical webinars, what I do is I'm the producer and I manage the intro, and then I turn it over to a speaker. And I also have a technical marketing engineer there who will handle the technical questions, and I assign it and manage it. If there are other things where people want to get your attention, I tell them, raise your hand and I'll check in chat, which is some of the things you can do to kind of do that engaging. And you know, that really helps. So I've learned how to multitask because I think that's what you have to do with webinars and still keep it on track. Right now, if you saw my desktop, I have the Q&A box open, I have the chat open, and I have my slide deck open. So I'm kind of multitasking here.
Yeah, and I'm doing the same thing. I've sort of been monitoring the chat on behalf of the instructors, and just in case I can bring things to their attention. But I notice Zoom webinar has both a chat and a Q&A, and I find having both is kind of confusing. I think if I were to do this in future, I'd probably turn one or the other off and just have people ask questions one way.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. There are a lot of things where you one of the things I like about On24 is the fact that you can create a community chat. So let's say you're talking about stock photography and you're looking for where you can buy it. So I would say that's a great place for chat. People who are in this webinar could actually share their resources and their ideas, and it's just among the attendees. And that's one way where I think On24 has done a really good job. And then they've kept the questions for the presenters or the producer off to the side. And that's another good way of doing it.
Yeah, and the Zoom webinar chat by default, it's kind of annoying because when you post something in chat, the default is to all panelists, and you can change that to all panelists and attendees. But I would suggest that should be the default, and I'm going to check and see if I can do that for future webinars with it. But because most of the people can't actually see the questions other people have written, because by default it's all panelists. And yes, the members can change that to go all
Right.
panelists and attendees, but most of them aren't going to know that.
Yeah, and I really do think that what we're talking about is having a conversation. And the more we can engage the attendees, the better off we are, because we don't know everything and they know a lot. And so I've learned from the presentation expert webinars that I've done, and I've done about 120 of them, I learned just as much from people who attended the webinars because they knew something I didn't. And they had a resource I didn't know about. So it's a great way for me to be educated. It's a great way for a community and all the attendees to be educated as well.
So another question's come up from Usarios is some suggestions about best software or platform for webinars.
You know, that's an interesting question. I'm currently going through an evaluation for this client. They have moved from GoToMeeting to Zoom, and they want to add Zoom webinars. But the one thing they didn't do when they were doing the selection, which is why I'm glad they asked me to be involved, is they didn't think about how they are using the webinar platform and whether or not the new platform would actually be equivalent. For example, Zoom, you can't really do handouts. Handouts on a technical webinar are really important. So things like that. The other thing that's really useful that we do is, and especially as it's global, and I'll talk a little bit about this in the case study, is if you've got a global audience and you don't want to tire out your speakers, you don't want to have, I have a Dell webinar coming up in January and it's on 6 different time zones. So I can't ask a senior level executive to be available for 6 webinars. So I'm recording it once when it's convenient for them, and then I'm inserting that video into the GoToWebinar platform for that event, and then we're doing a customized local language intro and Q&A at the end. And that way we can deliver that idea of kind of simulive. And that is not something Zoom does. So I spent 2.5 hours with a Zoom technical person this week looking at the ins and outs of this. So the question's very, very appropriate. If anybody wants more information, I'm going to have I'll do a blog about it if you go to webinarchick.com, and we'll probably do a contrast and compare for that I'm going to share with my client. I'll also create from my readers as well.
Maybe that's a topic you could teach for us next year, is something on all the different webinar softwares.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I mean, the one that I really love the power of On24, but the back-end production and I'll put my marketing hat on now, is not great for On24. You have to know HTML in order to create custom banners and how to set up the API so it connects with Salesforce or Constant Contact or one of the others. And you have to also do the banners in HTML. And it's not easy. If you don't know HTML, you're really screwed. So I wanted to show you the good, the bad, and the ugly. These are really bad slides. They don't tell anything. They're not appealing. I'm probably nodding off while I'm reading it. So you may have missed the message. I wanted to share some other ways of not doing slides. Here's a picture. It's very busy, and I put the text on that says, "Can you read this?" And a lot of times what happens is people will just use a busy picture and not customize it by putting a screen over it or making it a little bit more readable. So let's look at some good slides. This vulnerability slide was like the first text slide when I got it, and this is how we changed it. Here's another one I got that was just more heart disease and just making pictures instead of a whole bunch of stats. And then this third one was presenting data as to what was influential trends. Can you see there's a tech company here in the middle of this? So they're just some samples of how you can improve the look and feel of your webinars, because you don't have that in-person experience to be able to connect with your attendees. I speak with my hands. I'm still sitting at my desk, still talking with my hands, but you can't see me, but it's the way I have of trying to connect with you and understand, what you're looking for and how to best deliver the right product for you.
And that brought up a question that Deborah had, that previously in some of the sessions we've been doing, they were able to see the speaker. And currently, is your webcam turned off when we rebooted? Was that on purpose, or?
No, I actually turned it off because I was concerned it was too much, but I will turn it back on.
Yeah, I don't think that was the problem. I have a feeling the problem was either that
You
we're
can
using
see
the same.
I talk with my hands.
Yeah, I think it was the same webinar link both days, or it might have been my colleague might have accidentally clicked on the start button and started another one. So we could try it for a bit, see if it works.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely like the fact that you have the video and I use the video. I do notice that there's a slight delay, which is sometimes distracting if you've got the video up. So let me go to the next slide. Now that I have video up, it's not letting me go to the next slide. Ta-da. There you go. So step 5. I call it keep them happy. Build the audience engagement into your webinar plan. Make sure you do something before the webinar to really get them their attention. Make sure you do something during the webinar. I love polls, as I said. I also have a script of different topics or messages I want to give them as part of a moderator script. And I cut and paste that into chat. Just to say, hey, don't forget to download the handouts if there's a handout, or hey, don't forget to go to this website and you can download the handout, or hey, send me an email and I'll give you any of the templates. Things like that to kind of build that connection. There are also some great tools you can use. One of the things we talked about was making sure that you knew who your audience demographic is. That helps you really build your content. One of the tools that I've used is creating a custom registration form where I will ask a multiple choice question. And let's say it's how many people have DirecTV for cable. And you could say 5 choices. I do. I don't have cable. I have I have whatever, Dish. I have nothing, etc. And then you can then take that information. It's a great way to open your presentation with a slide that shares that data, and it then makes it relevant. And then if you need to, it also helps you adjust your content to make sure you're telling the right messages. Does that make sense? So I'm going to call this the break the ice session. I do a break the ice 15 minutes before to try and reach out and engage with the audience. It's a great way for the speaker to get warmed up. It's a great way for me to make sure everybody's audio and video is working. And I also go out and will say things like, well, I'm in rainy, thunder, clapping Los Altos, California, and it has been pretty crazy the last couple of weeks with all of the smoke. We've had really bad air quality. How is it in your neck of the woods? Or anybody that calls my phone knows that I'm a Penn State nut, and it rings the alumni fight song. So, I mean, there's some things where I try and then say, okay, tell me about what school you went to, or tell me what it is you're trying to learn today. And that also helps me with pre-gauging some of the things that we need to do as far as understanding content, or if somebody really wants to do the best practices on polling and how you do it, or what's the tips and tricks for doing that. We can take some of the early content and again find a way to customize the experience for the attendees. Be prepared. Don't panic. There is grace under pressure. Technology fails, so have a plan B, such as a second computer. And the next one is good for a couple of reasons. Prepare 3 or 4 preceded questions just in case the audience is quiet, or if you have a technology fail. My favorite story about this is we had a speaker at Presentation Expert who lives in Bali, and so his connection is questionable at all. So I had him give me 4 or 5 questions and answers in case we lost his connection. Guess what? We did. For he was gone for 3 minutes. So for 3 minutes I danced, but nobody knew that he wasn't there. So what we did is we asked, I said, we have some great audience questions. Let's go through them. And then I answered them instead of Taylor answering them. And that really helped to kind of keep it going. And the technology fail was not apparent to any of our attendees. And that's just an idea of a best practice you can put together and use to do. So are there any questions at this point? Be happy to answer them. Great. So I'm going to bring in a case study. So Concern EAP is a major player in the San Francisco Bay Area. Many of you may have employee assistance programs, counseling, parenting, childcare, elder care, all sorts of things as part of your benefits package. The challenge for Concern is that many of the companies they had, including Apple, Facebook, Google, McKinsey, American Express, HP, all had they were global companies and they were growing. And there was a real need to increase the amount of support and employee assistance for these employees, but there were some major problems and challenges that they had to overcome. One was that the client base was now in different locations in different time zones. That scaling the in-person seminars, they had been doing in-person seminars for 25 years. So if you went to an all-day seminar at your office, maybe on Money 101, emotional intelligence, learning to be resilient. These are just some of the topics that we did. They could not scale to that level. It was limited by cost of travel, the cost of the speakers themselves, and an insufficient speaker pool. They didn't have enough speakers who were both webinar technology savvy or were able to go do, 5 to 10 presentations in different cities. The clients also had a changing demographic. They were really growing and seeing into a lot of millennials and people who had started to depend on just-in-time learning. They had long work days. They were different schedules. They needed to find new ways to teach their employees life and professional skills. And that's where webinars came in. None of the in-person speakers knew how to present online. Not a single one had ever done a webinar. And we're talking about 64 speakers that we dealt with. Every one of them was freaked out and overwhelmed by the technology. We did sometimes 4 or 5 dry runs just to make sure they got it. And they had also followed a script word for word. So they were constantly reading a piece of paper. They didn't have any way to infuse their personality into the content because going off script was not encouraged. And that's something that webinars are great for because you can react to the audience. So to plan the transition to webinars, we kind of looked at all the materials, and all the materials were really outdated. They were still in the 4x3 PowerPoint. They weren't in 16:9. The content was boring. There was no engagement, and they really were not sure how to get to the next step. So what we did is review all the materials. The materials were the slide deck, the presenter's guide, which was a guide on how to engage with the audience, and the attendee guide, and then any additional toolkits or materials. And we did a complete branding and rebrand of everything. And it's a project I worked on for 4 years. We then looked at finding the right webinar platform based on the level of engagement. And actually, here's an example where the client didn't want to get involved in having a webinar engagement tool or a webinar platform, and I had one that I use for different clients. So they just basically rented that client, the webinar space whenever they needed to do a webinar. The other thing we did is create a webinar speaker one-on-one training program. This included handouts, and it was done in very plain English. We did on-demand webinars that we kept simple, 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 because we didn't want to overwhelm them, and we gave it to them in bite size. We only gave them a little at a time. We made it on 4 levels. One was an intro, then a beginner, then an intermediate, and then, oh my God, I think I can do this myself. So they were the levels that we did, and we had materials and handouts, and then we also created scripts that were more interactive for them so that they could actually use it as a guide, not as every word. And the goal of this was to build a repeatable process, because we really needed to find a way to repeat the process across time zones, across native speakers. And as the company grows, I mean, one of the Apple webinars I did in 9 time zones. So, you know, we found a way to make it work. So let me share a little bit about what the slides look like. The one on the left is what the slide was, and this is one of the better slides. The slide on the right is what we created for it, and we created, I created an entire PowerPoint template for them. We branded everything, and we then put this forth. So you can see there are definitely some, you know, existing differences. There are things that we did to make sure that, you know, they have an idea of what they could do. We created a housekeeping or slide deck that was custom for each client. We would brand it for Apple, we brand it for McKinsey, we brand it for Facebook, because not everyone had the same services. And so we were able to make that universal. So if someone was creating a webinar, we created a repository of slides that they could customize with instructions on exactly how to customize it. I also gave 2 in-person sessions for speakers on, you know, what makes good PowerPoint, what doesn't make good PowerPoint, and kind of how we would make the transition. And we went through specific examples of how to engage the audience, how to create the polling to see the value, and to understand how that interaction would really work. So at this time, I'm kind of done. If you have questions or any additional comments, I'm happy to answer them. Anything, as I said, that you're welcome to reach out to me, and I'll be glad to share with you any of the templates that I have. I have a great webinar script that I use. So any questions?
I've been frantically writing down notes while listening to this, Sharyn. But one question I have, and this is something we've really run into with this conference, is handling time zones, because we have people tuning in from around the world,
Right.
and trying to schedule things. You know, what should kind of be the central time zone? How do you manage telling everybody what the time is in their local time zones? It's great fun.
So I create a series of webinars. So what I do is, if I take a couple basic time zones and I set up, you know, individual times. So if you do maybe 10 a.m. in one time zone, 1 p.m. in another time zone, if they have the same time zone, there's just not a lot you can do from that perspective. But if you're doing them in different time zones, creating a series and then enabling the participant to make their own choice as to what time zone. Somebody may have found that 12 noon, because their stomach was grumbling, was not really good, but if we offered it at 12 noon and at 3, they'd have a chance to choose which one would work, plus having it on demand overcomes some of the other objections. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and Wilma's also added, you know, put up a link that shows your time zone versus other time zones, which we did a bit of that in the preparation for this. We are also recording the session, so hopefully people who couldn't attend because of time zones could do that. We did have one person complain, when am I going to get lunch?
Yeah, exactly. And again, I noticed there's a question.
There is, yeah.
Yeah, from Deborah. It says, after all the talks that say don't use bullet points, your last slide uses bullet points. The way you did it, I think, is fine. Wonder what some of the other speakers think about that, however. That's an interesting point, because one of the things you could do is use animations and builds to build the slides. I try and keep the content as little as possible because you don't want to overwhelm it, but in some cases it's not easy to do. Anybody else have thoughts about that? I'd love to hear. Garland, what do you think?
Well, I think it's like anything. You don't want to say never use bullet points, because there's some cases where certain things need a bullet point. I will often use a summary slide at the end to summarize what they've learned. And that's where a bullet point makes sense. They can see all the points. Also, when I teach people how to do better meetings, I have a series of bullet points, which are ground rules for your meeting, and that's easier to have all in one slide and bullet points rather than go through maybe the 10 ground rules, each having their own slide. So I think, a case of it's never about never, but I like, for the most part, I really like making 1 point per slide with the high graphics, which you've done in many cases. Your question slide's a good example of that. So.
Yeah, I think that, one of the things I've also done is there's a great webinar I did with Rick Altman of the Presentation Summit on how to survive handout hell. And I think that's a great example of how you can use it to create handouts that do have bullets, but that don't take away from your slide, but enhances your slide as a handout. And he gives some great examples, like I shared earlier, some of those are his. So, I mean, there's things that you can do to get around bullets. The rule, Mike Parkinson has a great webinar around the 5 silver bullets, and I try and really focus on that for each one. So for the steps, for example, I tried to stay within 5 to 6 to make sure that we didn't overwhelm it, and then try and talk through the slides, make it more interactive instead of, death by PowerPoint.
And Brad King has a question. When working with a new webinar presenter, to what extent do you coach them about hardware, in particular microphones and webcams?
A lot, but it depends on whether or not I'm the producer, in which case I don't bother them with it. I am doing El Camino Hospital, their post, they're customer consumer based, and I set up the microphone, set up the camera independent of them because I didn't think they could handle it from a technology perspective. In other cases, I will just tell them to do a simple headset, and I have a Brio Logitech camera, so it kind of helps with balancing the light and doing the backfill. So, I give them a list of recommended headsets and cameras if they want to do it. It's part of my package that I present to each client. Does that answer the question?
I assume so. I don't see anything else from Brad at this time. I really liked how you pointed out the handout ideas, like the infographics and the other ones, because often when I'm presenting, the conference organizers will say, oh, send us your PowerPoint so we can print them for notes for your attendees. And I'm going, well, my PowerPoint slides aren't really my handouts, because without the speaker, they're usually, if they were like 1 point each or just a graphic or a question, they're not really useful as handouts.
Yeah, and that's the point. I think that's what's really interesting, because it really depends on a couple of things. One is understanding your audience demographic. What is the target audience trying to do? Are you trying to tell them technical information? I don't know about you, but I need to print it and read it if it's going to be technical. So I want that handout, and I want it to be as detailed as possible. Or if I just want something as a reminder for best practices or tips and tricks, I have a lot of GoToWebinar kind of best practices that are infographic based. And if I have a client who's doing a share video for the first time or launching a poll, I give them as part of the packet for that webinar my instructions that looks very, physically and very visually pleasing.
I also liked your don't panic slide, and the timing on it was superb.
Yeah,
You had
and
a technical glitch. I've
yeah.
been presenting a long time, and even I find in person, you're almost never technical glitch free, or it doesn't matter how much you pay for a webinar software. It seems like they all have glitches or issues or problems, or your computer could have a problem, or their server could have a problem. So I really like the fact that you were talking about backups, and I liked what you mentioned about your one presenter where you had a question and answer session until he got back in, which was great. So thank you so much for sharing that.
There, I mean, another thing, I had an instance yesterday where for some reason my mouse is freezing, and I changed batteries and did a couple of things, and nothing seemed to work. So I had a second computer set up, and my main computer froze. So all I did is the presenters, there were two other presenters in the room, knew that I was going to log out of one and take over control with another. And so they didn't panic. So you know, it's sometimes it's just a battery that will make things difficult, but you never know. So I always have an extra battery. I always have, you know, just different stuff. I kind of have an emergency kit if I'm going to somebody else's location to do a webinar.
Yeah, I know. And when I present live too, I try to have every possible adapter for every possible projector. I mean, because there's always something. And one of my annoying things too is no matter how many times I boot up my computer before my presentation, it will still all of a sudden want to apply a Windows update when I'm about to start my presentation. And if I
We've all
stop
had
it, it whines.
Yeah. So I have had that happen, and I have kind of a prerequisite for every webinar I do. If a webinar, let's say, is at 10 a.m., I requires the speakers, if they're going to be physically in the room with me, I expect them to be in the room no later than 35 minutes before. That gives me a chance to make sure they're logged in, they don't have any problems, they share their PowerPoint, we pass presenting back and forth, because doing it in a dry run when you don't have a live audience is one thing, but doing it live when you're already nervous in the first place is a whole other story. So I tend to get the slides for webinars. I ask for them 24 hours in advance because I create a moderator script for each webinar that includes copies of the slides so we know where they are, instructions on how to launch the poll, etc. The slides I got yesterday at 3 a.m. and the webinar was at 10. And I had to go through and edit it at like 5:30 in the morning because English was not their first language, and there were a lot of typos in there. So, you know, they were using old icons and other things. So that kind of, talk about grace under pressure. As long as you give me a really strong cup of coffee, I'm happy to do that, and it's billable. But you don't want to go through the fire drills. So that's why I always say be prepared, do it in advance, do an audio check, make sure that it works. And I love doing the icebreaker because it's a great way to make sure everything works.
And it's a really good point about having the presenters there ahead of time. Like, I was really pleased when I noticed, I think I had in the room about 30 minutes ahead. I could see you in the attendee list. And then I go sigh of relief because I know that I can easily, pop you up to presenter level, and I'm not going to have to inflict Garland karaoke on the crowd.
No,
Not showing up.
no, we make it a technical. My cat TJ tends to like to walk across my computer when I'm live on events. So if you see him, he's very friendly.
Yeah.
So
well, I had another issue with one of the presenters yesterday. He was an experienced presenter, but just had some issues or something getting in, or was late, and basically arrived in about 1 minute before the presentation. And of course, I was at that point a little concerned and panicked. And so, and especially across time zones again, because you're going, well, if someone makes an hour difference, well, then they're logging in an hour late for their conference or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of have my, I sit down the morning of, and I'm going to answer, this goes to Brad's question about having a checklist, and the answer is yes. And that is my son that everybody is seeing live. Zach, can you go So anyway, he's here. So you can wave to him. He's leaving. So the thing I do is I do have a checklist, and I use the checklist in a couple of different ways. I have a list of things that I do pre-webinar, and I mentioned before having a worksheet. And what I can do is stop sharing, and I can grab that and kind of show you some of the things and what it looks like. The other thing I do is I go through a checklist the morning of. I make sure the handouts are uploaded. I make sure the videos are uploaded, you know, that kind of thing. And I think that really, really helps. So I try and do that as well. And I'm going to open Word, and I'm going to share my desktop again. Just let me close a few files. So let me share my screen. And this is my technology client. And this is a template that I've got in Word that I also have in Google Drive because they're a Google company. And I go through and actually, they help me fill this out. I send it to them. You know, they put in their ideas. We have a template started of what the content could be, topics. This happened to be one where we were doing with a third party. I put in the presenters. I put in their pictures, and you know, any additional stuff that I need to do. I put in pre-registration. What's the title? What's the abstract? What's the link? Here's the event page link, event form. And then this happened to be somebody else's checklist, but who should attend? So I make sure we have that. And then we also have our section for the website where we're using use case tags and stuff like that. So, you know, that's pretty important. And then if I look at, I'm going to search for a, okay, here is the moderator script that I'm going to share with you. And I have all these as templates, so I'll write, maybe we can put my email in chat. So this is kind of the moderator script. It talks about the logistics. It talks about the timing. It talks about, here's their actual link. And then I use a series of icons throughout the whole script that will go through and explain each section. So, you know, here it is, you know, here's a little bit of a script. Here's where we've got kind of the slides we're bringing in. Here's the script, the words we go with it. This is in case I got run over by a bus, somebody else can pick it up. And then we kind of then go to, okay, how do we then go to launching polls? And so we say, let's do a poll question. And then here's very specific instructions on how to launch the poll.
I'm just seeing the info part on your screen right now. Are you showing the actual document?
Yeah, I am. Interesting. Okay. I guess I didn't, I thought I was sharing my screen. So apologies.
I'm sharing an app or something, yeah.
Yeah, let me share the app. So let me go back through. Apologies there. This is a moderator script for the day of, and I use icons throughout the script to make it visual so people know where to go for what. So here's an action. My computer is going to be the main computer. Here's what I'm going to say to start it. Here's what the PowerPoint will be. You know, I think you get the idea. And then you'll see I do that all the way through. And when there's a poll question, there's the poll question. And then I have instructions on how to use it and how to launch it, what we do during it, how we compare everything, hide the presentation, and then kind of what's next. So there are notes. So I think this is kind of my master document for a webinar.
That's fantastic, Sharyn. I use a lot of checklists myself, but you've obviously done a lot more webinars than I have, so you have there. Most of mine are sort of preparation for me to do one webinar as opposed to managing a conference like this. I mean, things have gone great, and I think people got a really good value. But little things, like I think it would have made sense to print off a lot more of what I was doing because I would have to go to the website to get maybe someone's bio. So I'm looking over to the side, you know, trying to, you know, grab the points for the bio and things like that. So that really helps. I have a question about shaky webcams. I noticed, like, my webcam's sitting on top of my monitor, of course.
Right.
So when I start typing on the screen, it starts shaking. Now, it's fine for just a straight PowerPoint presentation because I'm only touching one key, so it doesn't shake much. But
Right.
if I'm actually calling up documents or typing in URLs, I find that it gets shaky. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I actually have a stand for both my my camera and my microphone, so I'm not dependent on it. So it doesn't impact. So, you know, that's what I did. And if you don't have a stand for it, you got to improvise. So until I bought a stand for this one, I actually piled a bunch of boxes up and then just wrapped it around the box, and it worked. So, I mean, you can, that's some of the things to do. The other thing too, from a sound perspective, is making sure your environment is really good for sound. I have a set of Bose studio headset. I have a studio headset, so hopefully my sound is pretty good. But, you know, I also am very conscious of the effort and the room around me and whether or not the acoustics are really good. And, you know, I've had speakers where they're in a room that has a lot of white. There's no carpet on the floor. And so it's very cold from the video perspective, but it also sounds like they're in a wind tunnel. So one of the speakers, when we prepared, we actually grabbed pillows and blankets and everything else and insulated her work area so that the sound would be improvement. A low-tech solution for a high-tech problem.
That's great. And I do have a separate stand for my microphone because I found, you know, it used to pick up the typing when I would type, like, or if I would tap the table at all, it would grab that sound. But my webcam, I should find a way to use a separate stand or a separate way of suspending that as well. And again, it's not too bad during normal presentations, but if I have to start typing and calling things up, it makes a difference.
You know,
Wow.
a way around that is I went and spent $3,000 on a gaming computer with solid state drives, and you won't hear the typing with the solid state drive.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. That was awesome. I don't think we have any more questions. I think we've gotten through them all.
Great. I put my name and contact information. If you want samples of any of the tools or any of my cheat sheets for GoToWebinar, let me know. I'm happy to send them.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for presenting for us today, Sharyn. And I learned a lot, took lots of notes, and hopefully next year will look much better, be up to your standards.
I think you did great. I've enjoyed this, and you know, I really have fun doing this stuff. And if you can't tell, I'm kind of a webinar geek. So I love webinars.
Thanks again, Sharyn. We'll sign you up now, and then we'll get